Notice that I use a lot of synthetics in these patterns. They are highly durable, they float well, and they'll last you a long time. The first one I'd like to do is this little cricket pattern called a crystal butt cricket. This I'm going to tie on a size 8, 2x long dry fly hook. It's a Timco 5212. I'm going to put the hook in the vise here. And one thing I do want to point out to you is in front of me is a little camera. It's called a POV, or a point of view camera. What this is going to allow you to see is the fly from my point of view. And I think it's a tremendous aid in learning how to tie these patterns, because you're going to be looking at exactly what I'm doing here instead of standing on the other side of the tying bench and trying to make out the details of this particular tying procedure. So we got the hook in the vise. You can see it from this little POV camera. And as usual, the first thing we do is simply to attach the thread to the shank of the hook. I'm going to start up here at the front, simply wrap that thread all the way to the rear. Tighten that up just a bit. And take the thread all the way back to the rear. Now these are big hooks, so you're going to have to use a fairly good bit of material and thread on these patterns. Once we get the thread to the rear of the hook, the next procedure is to tie in that little, what I call a crystal butt. And that's nothing more than a few strands of crystal flash. The one color that I prefer for this pattern is the opalescent peacock crystal flash. You notice I keep my crystal flash in these little tubes. It makes it a whole lot easier to work with. You don't have to have these fancy little clear plastic tubes. A soda straw will work just fine. You put it on a Loctite, pull it through the tube, and it gives you a nice little bit of material to work with out here. So cut a few strands of this, 6, 8 or so. Don't overdo it. You don't want to put too much of this in any pattern. I find that sometimes, as the case may be, less is actually more for these. So we'll take that crystal flash and tie it in right here at the end of the hook. Wrap it backwards, tie it down good and tight, and then I'm just going to clip just a little bit of that crystal flash left for the butt. Now I'm going to bring the thread back up about 2/3 the length of the hook shank. I'm going to tie in the body material for this fly. I'm going to use two things here. The first is a piece of closed cell foam that's 1/8 of an inch thick. I'm going to cut a little strip of this using a razor blade and a straight edge. First thing I'm going to do is lay down a piece of this material that architects and engineers use on their drawing boards. Cut a piece about, a little less than 1/4 of an inch thick. You need a sharp razor blade to do this. The more you tie this pattern, the easier it gets to estimate the thickness of that strip. That'll work just fine right there. So we tie this down at the point where the thread is and wrap it backwards. So we've got our body material tied in now. Then we do the next step, which is to take a piece of heavy black thread. I prefer the Good Broad G size thread. It's so strong you can't break it, and it works just fine for this pattern. The reason I'm going to do this is because we're going to rib the body with this thread and give it that segmented appearance that you see on crickets and hoppers and other insects that belong to this same order. We've got the thread tied in now, and that's what I'm going to use to rib the fly with. We'll pull that out of the way. The next step is to tie in the underbody wrap. This is a material that's called micro ice chenille. It comes in at least 6 different colors. This is the one that is referred to as mallard. Cut out about a 6-inch piece of this mallard micro ice chenille. And we're going to tie this in right back there where the thread was tied in. Kind of pull that thread out of the way, put it through your material clip. So we tie this micro ice chenille in right at the back of the fly. And then wrap the thread all the way forward to where you stopped the body material. So now we've got three things tied in: the body material, the thread that we're going to use for ribbing, and the piece of micro ice chenille. Then we simply wrap this forward. Cover up that foam that you've tied in. It gives a beautiful sparkly appearance to this fly. I think it adds to the fish catching appeal. Once you reach the point where the thread is, simply tie it off and trim away any of the excess. Now in the next step, I'm just going to fold this foam forward. Don't stretch it. You do not want to stretch this closed cell foam. Just simply fold it forward, hold it in position, and then hold it down with your thumb and forefinger. Tie it off. And then trim the forward projecting excess material, get it out of the way, and tie down whatever remains. You'll notice that this foam really ties down nicely. You know, don't be afraid if you get a little bulk in the front there, because it's going to disappear. The next step then is to rib the body. Just take your thread, and don't be afraid to put tension on this, because it's not going to break. This good broad G thread is incredibly tough stuff. And I'm just going to wrap 4 or 5 wraps of this to give that body a nice segmented appearance. Notice when I make these wraps, I'm kind of reinforcing that foam with this finger so that it doesn't roll over on the side of the hook. We get up to the front, make a couple wraps, and then tie that thread off, and of course trim the excess. Now we've got our body finished. I'm going to put rubber legs on at this point, and I like these round rubber legs that Umpqua markets in the large size for this particular fly. You notice they come in a sheet. All you have to do on a sheet of these legs is just to strip off however many you need. On this particular fly, I'm going to tie in 2 legs, so I'll leave these 2 pieces attached and pull them off together. Notice how I tie this in. I'm not going to separate these legs. I'm going to tie the whole piece in right here. Leave them together, tie in the piece, tie it down firmly. Then I'm going to cut the legs just about the same distance back to the butt of the fly. They're still attached together. The next step is to take the point of your scissors, separate these 2 legs. Now what you have to do is to have these legs on lateral sides of the fly. You don't want them sticking up like that. And the way to accomplish that is to make a figure 8 wrap. The first wrap is going to go behind the leg that's away from me, and then up behind the leg that's on my side of the fly. Once the thread is in this position, all I have to do is hold this leg where I want it, tie it down, bring the thread up to the other leg, sort of tie it in position. You see how nicely those work. If you learn to do those rubber legs that way, you'll never have any problem. If you try to tie them in separately, it gets a little more difficult. Now I have the legs tied in, and you can see what those look like there. You can make them longer or shorter if you want, whatever you prefer. Now this fly has a little black hair wing on it, and for this I prefer elk hair. You can use deer hair, but deer hair is going to fuzz out in the front. It's going to be much softer, and it's going to give you some problems the way it wants to flare up. So I'm going to take a little of this dyed black elk hair. Don't use too much of this. You don't need a tremendous amount, just enough to give the hint of a wing. Cut a little clump of that. And then using a hair stacker, even up the tips. Just put your hair in the hair stacker, tips in first, and just tap that on the table. You don't want to be doing this at 2 o'clock in the morning, or your wife is going to get pretty upset. Once the tips are evened up, pull the hair out by the tips. And I always point the tips in the direction in which I want to tie this wing. If you do it this way, then you won't be trying to change hands, and if you do that, you're just going to mess things up. So you just pull the hair out, using my left hand in this case. Lay the winging material right over the top of the fly. And I want the tips to extend a little bit past the butt of this fly, sort of into that crystal leg, crystal butt. Hold it down. And I always give this a couple of loose wraps just to kind of get everything positioned. And once those wraps are in place, I can tighten down on the thread. Then bring the thread rearwards, and you've got that wing tied in pretty nicely now. Then we have to trim this hair. So just bring your scissors in, trim that hair at an angle so that when you tie it down, it's going to form a nice tapered front portion. The rest of the fly is going to go very nicely then. So we trim that hair off, and then sort of hold the wing back. I'm going to tie all this hair down now. Just take your thread, wrap that well in the front, pull any little wayward hair out of the way, and tie the butts of that hair down. It looks kind of messy, but the next step is going to take care of that. Then I bring the thread up to right behind the eye of the hook and add a little black dubbing to the thread. Doesn't make any difference what you use. I think the finer dubbing is going to work better than some of the coarse. And I'm going to take some of this black dubbing here. I'm just going to attach that to the thread. Just spin it onto the thread. Another reason I like fine dubbing is the fact that you don't have to use wax to do this. If it's fine enough, it'll just simply attach to the thread with no problem at all. Just spin that around on the thread. Then I'm going to wrap a little underbody up here. Just a little black dubbing on the head, and that's going to cover up those little butts that were left when I trimmed the hair. So now we've got a little underbody up there in the head region. The head I use on this fly is made from a little foam disc. This is what it looks like, and the way I get these is to take a piece of foam. This is 1/8 inch foam. This is thinner than the foam that, or pardon me, 1/16 inch foam. This is thinner than the foam that was used on the body. The body foam was 1/8 inch thick. This is 1/16 inch thick. I use a set of cutters. You don't have to get this fancy, but any sort of brass tubing will work. You can buy brass tubing at hobby shops, craft shops, or what have you. And I'm going to use this for most of the flies that you see in this series. So you select the size cutter that you want. This happens to be about a 3/8 of an inch tube here. I sharpen these using a little instrument that's called a case deburring tool. You can get these at shops that sell reloading supplies for people that reload their own ammunition. All you do with this, you notice it's got two ends on it. One end will fit inside the brass tube. Just give it a few turns. The other end will fit over the brass tube. Give that a few turns. Now you've got a tube that has a razor edge on it. All you have to do with this is to simply put it down on your foam, twist it a bit, and you'll come out with a nice little disc. When I pop this disc out, it's going to look just like the one that's lying on the tying table here. So once we get this disc cut, and by the way, I cut a lot of these at one time. I don't just cut one, I'll cut 2 or 3 dozen. Again, I'm going to use this little foam disc. This is about a 3/8 inch disc. Of course, you can vary the size of the disc to match the size of the fly that you're tying. I'm going to lay this disc down on top, and one thing I should point out is you see where I've brought the thread. It's about halfway back through this head material here. Bring your thread back to that point. Lay the disc over on top of the fly. The front of the disc should be just about even with the end of the eye of the hook. Give it a couple of good wraps, 2 or 3 wraps. Tie it down nice and tightly, and then finish it off with a half a dozen other wraps. Now we can finish that head by simply whip finishing it getting the thread out of the way. Take your whip finisher. Just give 4 or 5 good wraps. Cut your thread. Now I'm going to dress this fly up a little bit. I like eyes on most of my terrestrial patterns, and the crickets and hoppers are no exception. What I'm going to use for the eyes is some of this easy shaped sparkle body, and I like this yellow one. It shows up nicely. This is a dark fly, and sometimes these little eye spots really help you locate this thing under low light conditions. So we just rotate the fly in one direction, add a little drop of this easy shaped sparkle body on the side of the head, rotate the fly over, put another one on. Now this is going to take a little while to dry. You can move this to a foam block or a little magnetic strip or whatever you want. It'll take about an hour for this eye material to dry. Once it dries, that stuff will stay on very, very nicely. I like this cricket pattern for a number of reasons. First of all, it floats low in the surface film. It has this nice sparkly underbody. It has this sparkle butt on it. And these 2 little bright yellow eyes, I think, really give the fish something to key on. It's been a very effective pattern for me, particularly on spring creeks, that low water situation, thin water. Fish it right to the bank and hold on, because I've caught some nice fish on this pattern.